Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. The symbolism of Fort Sumter to both sides during the Civil War cannot be overestimated. The South's first victory in April 1861, the Confederacy wanted to hold it at all costs, and the North wanted it back just as much. By late 1863, the once magnificent brick fortress had been pummeled into little more than an immense pile of debris. And yet, a Confederate garrison inside held on. Today's video is about a Confederate captain inside Fort Sumter during the wee hours of November 23rd, 1863. About 4 a.m., a sentinel at Fort Sumter reported to the man pictured here, Captain Frank Harleston, that the tide had washed aside a section of sharply pointed chevaux de frise placed along the outside of the fort's battered walls for defensive purposes. Harleston was the perfect man to inspect the damage. Intelligent, highly respected, he had graduated from South Carolina Military Academy at the head of the class of 1860. According to one writer, quote, young Harleston is one of our best Citadel boys, end quote. After South Carolina seceded from the Union, Harleston joined the Academy's Corps of Cadets at Morris Island in Charleston Harbor and received an appointment as an officer in the state's 1st Artillery. He was assigned to the garrison at nearby Fort Moultrie. Officials there ordered him to man a floating ironclad battery at Cummings Point shortly before the momentous bombardment of Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, while the battle raged, while the bombardment against Fort Sumter raged, an officer observed Harleston and another lieutenant working their guns, so the officer said, with all the rapidity which the order of firing permitted. That was his role in the historic attack that ended in the fall of Sumter. After the fall, Harleston returned to Fort Moultrie and served there for a time as an adjutant. Later in the year, in 1861, he became an aide-de-camp to Brigadier General Roswell Ripley. He didn't stay too long. He left the position in early 1862 and at that point went to Fort Sumter as captain of the 1st Artillery's Company D. His responsibilities at the fort included the training of recruits, a task that reportedly tried his patience, but resulted in producing artillerists who, according to one writer, quote, became experts in their handling of heavy ordnance, end quote. They would need those skills, for Harleston and his gunners would be put to the test in the summer of 1863 after the enemy, Union forces, established heavy artillery batteries on nearby Morris Island. Shells from those heavy batteries and from Union warships in the harbor crashed through Sumter's brick and mortar walls, literally as though they were made of pasteboard. In fact, the bombardment was so fierce it was very difficult to escape injury. He was slightly wounded by one shell, although it was not serious. He was hit. He couldn't do much more than hunker down with his men as the enemy fire reduced the fort to rubble. By early September, Harleston and his men were withdrawn for a well-deserved break from the constant shelling from the Union boats and the shore batteries. A few weeks later, around the end of September, Harleston and his command reoccupied Fort Sumter, which continued to be bombarded. So you can imagine what it was like after taking a break of the heavy bombardment to have to go back to it. They endured all of that. And in fact, Harleston's term of duty was supposed to expire on November 21st. but the post commander asked him to stay a little while longer. This was November 21st, 1863. He agreed, and then soon after that, he received the call about that missing section of those sharpened sticks, the French name chevaux de frise. And because he was asked to inspect, he went outside, meandered outside the fort's walls to check out the damage and find out what exactly was going on. This was important because you wanted those defensive positions in place in the event that Union sailors or soldiers rowed boats and tried to attack the fort. Well, he went out and he didn't return. Folks became concerned. About 15 minutes later, a detail of Confederates inside the fort went outside to try and find him. Well, they didn't have to look long. They found him lying on wet rocks near the water's edge, writhing in agony. One shell fired from a massive Parrott gun, had smashed into the rocks at the very edge of the fort and exploded. The fragments strewn all over the place. They ripped into Harleston's thighs and an arm, terribly mangling his body. According to one report, quote, he was borne into the fort that he had fought for so gallantly, and his heart's blood flowed upon her stones, end quote. Harleston continued to linger in pain, agonizing pain, as his wounds took their toll, suffering. He lingered for hours before succumbing to these injuries, which proved mortal. He was all of 23 years old. An officer later eulogized him, quote, "What a beautiful character that young man had, so gentle and so strong. I think his death was more regretted than that of any other man whom I came in contact with during the war. He was so much respected by his commanders and so truly loved by his equals and subordinates," end quote. His death rippled through the officer corps. A lot of people mourned his passing. Word of his death made it all the way up the chain of the command to the general in charge, PGT Beauregard. Beauregard issued an order. He wanted to have a gun emplacement located on James Island, have its name changed to Battery Harleston in the young officer's honor. So thanks for listening to the story of Frank Harleston, one of Citadel's best, who became a captain of the 1st Artillery, was in Fort Sumter, and paid the ultimate price. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.